Hey everyone, welcome back to the Jacobin Show. I'm Jen Pan here with Paul Prescod. We were actually off last week, so happy to be back, of course, with Paul, who apparently can't hear. So we'll try to figure that out. But in the meantime, I just want to mention, of course, we've got a great show today. Marianne Williamson, the one and only Marianne Williamson, who, of course, ran for president in 2020, but is also a national best-selling author and activist, is going to be joining us a little later to talk about basically the horrors of capitalism and what kinds of campaigns she's getting involved in today, what she makes of the Biden administration, and basically how we move forward, post 2020 when the left is kind of on the back foot. And we're also getting Matt Bruenig, who is, of course, the founder and president of the People's Policy Project. He's been on the show before to talk about the welfare state, how we build a better one, what it looks like in other countries. He's going to be joining us in a little bit as well for a kind of mini interview to talk about Biden's new child tax credit and kind of the good and bad of it. But what I'm really excited to talk to him about is kind of the difference between what he calls poor people benefits and the difference between those and welfare benefits, which of course in the US have historically been one and the same. But I think he makes a pretty compelling argument for why we should think about breaking the link between those two things. And I just want to mention that his article is published in Jacobin under the title, "Let's Make the US a Welfare Nation." You can also find it on his website, which of course is People's Policy Project. So, I guess while we are waiting for Paul to re-enter the chat, there is something that that I've been thinking about for kind of a while. And since it's the summer and this show today is kind of a bit of a grab bag of different topics, I thought maybe this would be a good time to kind of hit this topic. So I know I've joked either on this show or on weekends before that I talk about Bernie Sanders so much that if you were playing a drinking game based on how often I mention Bernie, you would probably be dead of alcohol poisoning already. Apologies, I am going to talk about Bernie again. There are a couple different reasons why he has been on my mind lately. The first is, I think I've mentioned before that I recently moved to Albuquerque. So I've just been walking around and, trying to get to know my new neighborhood. And on my walks, I've noticed in the area where I live, quite a few cars that have both Bernie 2016 and Bernie 2020 bumper stickers side by side. So I'm always excited to see that. I'm always happy to see that. And then the other reason why I was thinking about Bernie is because some of you probably saw that there was a really great interview with Bernie in the New York Times. He had an interview with the columnist Maureen Dowd, and he basically showed up to the interview with a paper list of topics that he just refused to deviate from. So it was the spending bill, healthcare, paid family leave, just classic Bernie stuff. And every time that Maureen Dowd would try to ask him about something else, I think she tried to bring up Dua Lipa or Joe Manchin's houseboat, Bernie would just unabashedly pivot back to the list, which of course I think is very classic Bernie. He's done this time and time again. And it actually reminded me of what I think is his greatest pivot of all time. This happened back in 2016 when he was on the campaign trail. I don't know if you guys remember, but there was one incident where a group of topless protesters crashed his campaign event, right? And afterwards, a reporter asked him about it. A reporter was like, "Hey, did you see there was this one woman and she had something written across her bare chest? Did you happen to see what that was?" And according to BuzzFeed, Bernie, let me bring up the quote here. Bernie seamlessly pivoted. Sanders then seamlessly pivoted from the subject of the woman's breasts to his economic message. "No, actually, I was trying to focus on a couple of other things," he said. And what we were focusing on is the disappearance of the American middle class, the fact that almost all new income and wealth is going to the top 1%, and that we need to create an economy that works for all of us and not just wealthy campaign contributors. So this, again, I love this. I mean, like I said, it's just super classic Bernie. And, I guess just thinking about Bernie, it has kind of made me think about how, I think in the wake of his 2020 campaign, because of, the end of his campaign and, of course, the onset of the pandemic, the left is kind of in a lull in this moment, right? Like, I feel like things are pretty rudderless. And so just thinking about Bernie, made me think about that, and also made me think about what I think is so remarkable about his two campaigns, even though, of course, he did not win. And, the best way I can put it is that I sometimes joke that Bernie deradicalized me. I actually once said this to Bhaskar, and he pointed out, I think fairly, that the word de-radicalize kind of makes it sound like you're in Al-Qaeda. Of course, I promise I was not in a terrorist cell. What I mean is that Bernie's run for president in 2016 was really significant because the left was so weak and so disconnected from any kind of political power in the US at that time, or prior to his run, that I think it was really easy, if you were a leftist, to just take these extremely radical positions, because there was really no hope of any of it coming to fruition in any real way, right? The stakes, I don't think, were just low. I think that they were completely non-existent. So what I mean is, prior to 2016, it was really easy to go around, saying things like full communism now, or like abolish work, or, I would obsess over these extremely obscure academic theories, or even fetishize the very idea of marginality. And I think the kind of worst thing was that being immersed in this style of radicalism, which of course had no real world channel whatsoever, also sort of led to glamorizing extremely confrontational or even antisocial behavior, like Weather Underground style, revolutionary violence, or being really into the idea that the left should arm itself to the teeth for future revolutionary activity. And obviously for the 99, for the vast majority of people who are into this so-called radicalism, including myself pre-Bernie, it's just talk, right? It might seem exciting and even militant, but the truth is that this is just posturing. I mean, I probably don't have to tell anyone that, anybody on the internet who's like, well, fuck around and find out, is probably just sitting at home. And I guess the point is not that, people are blowhards or they're showing off or whatever. I think what I'm trying to get at is that this kind of posturing, or this position, comes from a place of total powerlessness and even nihilism. Because when you feel like there's no possibility for even the most basic social and economic reforms, it's kind of like, why not embrace the most esoteric concepts and embrace these totally unachievable or extreme positions, right? Now, why did this happen? Well, we know that the labor movement and the social safety net in the US have both been steadily eviscerated by free market champions on both sides of the aisle for decades, right? The Democratic Party has drifted to the right on economic policy over basically the last 40 or 50 years. And what this means is that since the 1970s, the left has essentially been confined to only these niche activist spaces and the academy. And I think after so many years of just complete marginalization and decline, we really had no clear model on the left of what electoral success could even look like until Bernie ran in 2016. So, he runs in 2016, and I think that things changed. I think that his insurgent bid for the presidency, I think it went a lot further than anybody thought it would. He basically became the most popular politician in the US over a very short period of time. And I think that those factors, more than any radical book about, say, post-work or communist automation or abolishing the family or whatever, actually showed us what is possible beyond our current completely bleak moment of rampant economic inequality. I think our friend Matt Karp has put it really well. Last year on Twitter, he wrote, "Bernie lost, but over 5 years, he gave the feeble American left a precious gift, a common program based on ambitious universal economic demands, Medicare for all, college for all, jobs for all, and a common politics based on a fierce rejection of billionaire class rule. These are things the US left has never had before in this century, not after the battle in Seattle in 99, not after the crash in 08, not after Occupy in 11 or Ferguson in 14. Bernie's program and Bernie's politics showed that a left of thousands can become a left of millions. Now, obviously, I agree completely. And I just want to say, of course, don't get me wrong, Bernie becoming president and Bernie's platform becoming policy was always a long shot. I don't think anybody had any illusions otherwise. That said, I do think it was still the best opportunity that the left has had in decades to try to make life a little less punishing for working people today. And I think if you're a socialist today, you essentially have two tasks at hand. So one is, of course, the work of trying to make radical left ideas popular. You might call this consciousness raising, or you could call it, building class consciousness among the working class. And I think over the last several decades, the left has tended to spend a disproportionate amount of its time and energy on this part. And of course, again, it's precisely because we have had no political power, and it's really the only thing that we've been able to do, right? Education, trying to get the message out there, trying to shift the Overton window, as some people say. But I actually think that post-Bernie, the more important task, which unfortunately is also the more difficult task, is finding a way of actually amassing power so we can transform any existing public goodwill toward left ideas into reality. So what I mean is, after 2016, we basically know that there are parts of Bernie's platform that are incredibly popular, right? So things like raising the minimum wage, Medicare for all, paid family and sick leave, other forms of, social spending, increased spending on infrastructure. These are all ideas that currently have pretty widespread and robust public support, and often across party lines. So if we look at something like Medicare for all, the challenge that we're facing when it comes to implementing Medicare for all actually is not an ideological battle of trying to convince, the masses that our current healthcare system is incredibly broken and cruel and dysfunctional. I think that most people already know from personal experience that healthcare in the US is just does not work, and in many cases is outright barbaric, right? So what that means is our main obstacle to winning Medicare for all is, unfortunately, the political system itself. It isn't about changing hearts and minds necessarily. It's about finding a way to build enough working class power to actually overcome the policymakers and just the other elites who are incredibly hostile to the idea of single payer healthcare, despite what the majority of their constituents want. We have to find a way to confront the ruling class, in other words. So, when I say that Bernie, quote, deradicalized me, I don't think, it doesn't mean that he made me more centrist or more moderate. I'm sure there are some people who see it that way. But what I'm actually talking about is that, for me, and I think for many others, his two campaigns demonstrated that we really need to think seriously about political strategy, and also that left politics is not or should not be about being the most radical person in any given room, right? Or even cultivating a vanguard. I think that Bernie showed us that it's possible to craft a majoritarian politics around the kind of world that we want. And just to kind of wrap up, if I haven't said it explicitly before, I personally think that the most important political project of our time in the US right now is Medicare for all. Of course, this was a campaign that was kind of jump-started by Bernie. And as he has pointed out many times, the reason Medicare for all is important isn't just that our for-profit healthcare system is cruel and dysfunctional and it kills people, although of course, as I said before, all those things are true. But Medicare for All is also crucial because it's a program that would really help shift power away from a small number of employers to the vast majority of workers. And it does this, of course, by simply reducing the need for workers to stay in bad jobs in order to keep their employer-sponsored healthcare. Medicare for All would make being unemployed far less harrowing. And I think we also have a few studies that show that it would probably raise a lot of people's wages. So for me, after Bernie, I think when we're deciding where and how we're going to commit our political energy, I think that the very first question that we start with has to be the question, will this help transfer power to the working class? Not is this radical, or is this going to overthrow capitalism tomorrow, or even like, is this reformist? But rather, as I said, will this transfer power to the working class? And I think that Bernie's two campaigns really helped clarify what our priorities should be in this regard. And I also want to say that I do think that he helped lay a partial blueprint for how to win. Now, of course, he did not win. So again, this blueprint is only partial. But that said, I do think that there is a lot that we can take away from his strategy. So I think among Bernie fans, the high point of his campaign in 2020 is often thought of as right after the Nevada caucus, right? He won that caucus. It was like a tough and ugly fight, but he came out on top. And I think, it really looked like he was picking up steam. And then, of course, there was the disappointment of Super Tuesday. But I also want to point out, on Super Tuesday, he won California. And I actually think that this doesn't get talked about enough, but I think it's really important. Why? Because California is the most populous and most diverse state in the US, first of all. But the second reason, and I think this is more important, the way that he won was just unbeatable ground game. And part of that ground game included going to blocks of voters or blocks of people who lots of politicians had kind of written off. So he very heavily canvassed and did outreach in Latino neighborhoods, in Asian American neighborhoods. And these are two racial groups that actually politicians tend to ignore quite a bit. It's kind of a, sick cycle where it's especially with Asian Americans, the idea is like, oh, well, they don't vote, turnout is low. So like, why would we reach out to them? Bernie threw that by the wayside. Like I said, canvassed heavily among these two groups and won them. He won a lot of working class voters, actually. He, as I said, won the state. And so, again, I think that even though, it has to be said again, he didn't win, there is a lot that we can take away. And just to kind of wrap up on, the subject of radicalism or like de-radicalization, I just, of course, have to invoke that when Bernie talks about his platform, he, of course, very famously often says, these ideas are not radical. And I personally think that that is a perfect way of approaching politics.
Very well said. I'm back. Sorry about that.
You arrived just in time.
Right. Yeah. And I caught a lot of what you said. I think that's really well said. And I think, while it's true that these social democratic ideas and policies aren't radical, I think it's also true that in this moment, for me, fighting for social democracy is the thing radicals, if you care about that label, should do at this moment. And, after Bernie, there was a lot of like pessimism on the left, or a lot of talk about, should we be pessimistic or optimistic? And maybe I'm delusional or a little crazy, but I actually thought our takeaway after Bernie should have been pretty optimistic. I think the takeaway was, wow, we're on to something here. These ideas are popular. There's a base for them. We need to keep campaigning around them. We can become more rooted in working class communities and institutions. We can now have a basis to reestablish that connection between the left and labor. And yes, these policies are basic in many ways. Like, we should have won these things 80 years ago, but It's like, I mean, so what? This is where we are. And I think, it's radical to think about not just about what you're fighting for, but who you're moving to fight for something. Like, what constituencies can you actually move to fight? And that is what's going to set the stage for winning more in the future. And, in this country, we're starting from a very low level of class consciousness and class organization. We know we've never had a viable labor party. We're still at the fundamental point of what some people call like class formation, or just getting more working class people to act as a class for itself. And so for me, what this means is like our immediate tasks are things like getting more people in unions, more people to experience successful strikes, more campaigns winning tax the rich ballot initiatives, which we've talked about on this show before, more unions endorsing Medicare for all, more candidates who are, working class champions winning in like Republican rural districts, renewable energy projects that are using union labor. And like none of these things are necessarily revolutionary. And you might think these are pretty basic, but I think these are like the necessary prerequisites before we can really start going for more. And I think, as limited as electoral politics are, I think it forced many of us on the left to start thinking more seriously about politics. And Jane McAlevey talks a lot about the importance of yes or no or up and down campaigns. So campaigns with a clear definition of winning and losing. So workers either vote in the majority to join the union or they don't. The ballot initiative either wins or it doesn't. And I think like this electoral campaign forced us to think about, okay, why is this community or demographic not won over to the message? What do we have to do to move a certain constituency? And usually you'll find the answer has nothing to do with sloganeering or posturing or being the most radical. And I think, elections kind of register the mood of the country. And I think this election showed there's a lot of potential for leftists, actually, but we have a lot of work to do.
Yeah.
And that work is not going to look like Russia in 1917. At least I don't think so. I mean, it's probably going to look more like the workers.
Oh, you're not storming the Winter Palace after this?
I'm not. I mean, if other people do it, I'll tag along. But, it's probably going to look more like a protracted period like the Workers' Party in Brazil, which built up, first it started in a region and built up literally over decades to the point now where they, got in power and can do some things. But so that's going to require staying focused on these important reforms for a long period of time. And that's hard enough. I mean, can we start? And like, I hate to use like a corny sports analogy, but it's like, I haven't played basketball in years. Like my first goal, if I want to play again, I'm not going to like try to get into the European leagues. Like maybe I should like try to beat my brother in the game of
I was going to say start with horse.
So, and I don't know. I mean, I guess it sucks that maybe we're at a more elementary level, but like, I guess
that's
the good news. I mean, and actually the good news of that is that it kind of simplifies our tasks, We're not in power yet. We don't need to like worry about how we're not going to sell out yet. Like, how about we like increase union density to like 20%? That'd be cool.
Right. Yeah. Agree totally. And I want to add, because, you brought up earlier this idea that right after Bernie, it was kind of like, should we be pessimistic? Should we be optimistic? I agree with you. I felt pretty optimistic. I mean, it obviously like sucked a lot that he, didn't win in 2016 and didn't win in 2020. Like there's no, like, I don't, obviously, like, I'm not trying to say, like, I feel great because the, like, real success was the friends that we made during the campaign or whatever, like that corny line. Right. Like, I don't believe that. Like, it was a devastating blow. But I think, on the subject of optimism, or maybe I should say, like, tempered optimism, something else I was thinking is like the flip side of the coin of like radical leftist nihilism, where you're just like basically like with your guns and like ready for the revolution and, just like default to the most like radical or like nihilistic or extreme left position you can think of. I think that the flip side to that coin is a kind of like weird over optimism or triumphalism, I guess, where like, and actually, like, unfortunately, like, I think that, like, lots of people still kind of fall into this, and I myself may fall into it at times as well. But it's kind of like, like a big strike happens, right? Or like, Bernie, like, won one caucus, or, or like when the NBA players went on strike during the Black Lives Matter protests. I think sometimes there's a lot of talk where it's like, oh, like, things are really, like, kicking off, and there's often an implication that a group of, oppressed or exploited people, whether that's like blue collar working class people or like Black people as a racial group, are just like already revolutionary and just like waiting to kick off if we would just remove the boot from their neck. And I don't think that kind of left dialogue or discourse is healthy either. And I actually think that Bernie was sort of able to, like, at least for me, like, help me become clearer-eyed about like who people are and what their politics and what their, interests are. As I think I've said many times on this show, people are actually pretty idiosyncratic. So, like we brought this up before. You can have a voter in Florida who will vote to raise the minimum wage to $15, but will also vote for Trump. I think people are just less sort of predictable than we sometimes make them out to be. And of course, I hope it goes without saying that just because you're blue collar or, Black or a person of color, like in some kind of like historically marginalized group, like doesn't mean that you are radical. And I think that sometimes the left, maybe not purposely, but has kind of inadvertently like promulgated that narrative.
Right. Yeah. And because it's kind of an easier narrative because, I think an organized constituency has to be built. It's not like ready-made, and I think, and again, like the electoral realm kind of teaches like, okay, you got to start getting into some of the messy politics of that, and it's like, okay, why didn't we have our Jim Clyburn there in a position that happened over decades, that couldn't have been. I sometimes get in some arguments with people about South Carolina, like, well, if Bernie would have done this, if he would have shaken more hands with this person or that person, it's like, well, no, I mean, he had a few months essentially to like try and overturn the hegemony of the Democratic Party establishment that's been built for generations, and I can't believe I'm saying this, but I don't consider myself a Maoist, but I think the concept
the truth is out.
Right. The concept that I love of protracted struggle on all fronts, I think is actually extremely relevant, and we can adopt it for where we are today. It has to be a very protracted, level of engagement in different areas of politics to really like move forward.
I have a really quick question for you, because you have been an organizer, a labor organizer prior to Bernie, through Bernie, and of course after Bernie. I'm not sure if you were active in DSA before Bernie, but I think you were, right? Like you're an OG.
Actually, no, DSA specifically through Bernie.
Okay. But you were involved in
politics broadly, before then. Yeah.
So I am wondering if you feel like the left right now post Bernie is kind of back to where it was before Bernie, or has something changed, or what is different about it?
Well, I don't think it's gone back. I still think we're in a better position. Now, that's not saying much. I mean, again, literally people need to remember like 2013 is like, holy shit, we got 20 socialists in a room.
Right.
We are on to something.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I think, we've definitely cleared some hurdles. I don't think we're back to then, but I think, and this is something, Adolf Reed has said to me a lot about, what he was hoping would happen during Bernie was like, people would view it kind of soberly as like an organizing opportunity. And, and that kind of rang true for me because like through the Labor for Bernie work we did, we established a lot of contexts of unions that we still work with today on things like Medicare for all or different things. So I don't think enough of that opportunity was grabbed. I think, in certain areas of the country, yes, in certain cities, certain regions. But yeah, I think we are at a point of being like a little rudderless and kind of all over the place and going from one thing to the next. And what I kind of hope was like, again, Bernie, yes, the Hail Mary was that he won, but like more importantly, he kind of established like, okay, here is a whole slew of policies that I've just proven are very popular. Even though I didn't win, I proved they're very popular. And now let's like keep organizing around them.
Right.
So again, I think that's happened in some ways, but not in others. But I do think we're still in a better place than we were in the dark pre-Bernie days.
Right. The dark ages. Since you mentioned Adolf Reed, I actually forgot to say this earlier, but our guests for next week are going to be both Adolf Reed and Walter Ben Michaels. So you definitely do not want to miss that. So tune into our show next week. I think it's going to be a really fun discussion. Walter Ben Michaels recently gave a keynote at a conference, which he's going to be talking about when we have him on. And Adolf Reed has, I think, 1 or 2 new pieces in Non-Site, which is the publication that I think they're both contributing editors to. So just a preview of next week's show. And on that note, I think that we have our first guest here with us. We are bringing on Matt Bruenig, who is, of course, the founder and president of the People's Policy Project. Matt, welcome back to the Jacobin Show. You are now a repeat guest. We've been saying that you're kind of like our welfare king, I guess.
Yes. Not in the literal sense that I'm have Cadillacs and food stamps, but
Right. Well,
that's what I aspire to.
yeah, exactly. And actually, so on that subject, you recently had a piece which you published on the People's Policy Project website, but it was also published on Jacobin with the title "Let's Make the U.S. a Welfare Nation." And in this piece, you look at the new child tax credit, which of course began earlier this month, and you show that the rollout of this benefit now means that 65% of people in the US live in a household now where at least one person is receiving a monthly check from the government. Prior to this new CTC, it was only 28%. And of course, the monthly check is not just the CTC, but it's things like disability and Social Security. So when I was reading your piece, I thought that the kind of heart of it was that in your piece, you distinguish between welfare benefits and what you call poor people benefits. And of course, in the US, historically, these have been one and the same, right? But you argue that the new CTC kind of breaks that link a little bit. So can you talk a little bit about what it does sort of differently? And then following from that, why do we want welfare benefits but not poor people benefits?
Yeah, so I mean, the old CTC was also not a poor people benefit, but it was also not a very salient benefit. You didn't receive a monthly check. It just kind of got lopped off your taxes in a very opaque way. So now we have something that looks much more like a conventional welfare benefit. It's coming in the account every month. It's a check. It's very, very conspicuous. And so in that sense, we have this new welfare benefit in a traditional sense of the word. And what I was trying to point out in the piece is, and it might be useful to get a little background on this, there have been these debates in the policy circles for going back, 15, 20 years, including a lot of people on the left and center left who, they would make these claims that people really don't want to receive. They don't want handouts. They don't want handouts, right? So we need to focus on increasing their wages, or we need to focus on maybe giving them money in ways that is sort of opaque to them so they don't feel like they're receiving a handout. And that even poor people don't like receiving handouts. They feel kind of gross about it. Nobody wants to be on food stamps. It feels stigmatized, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's kind of been the underlying theory of why people on the left have been so supportive of this sort of tax credit state that we've built. And what I try to point out is that whole analysis, what it misses is that these benefits that people report not liking are benefits that don't really go to a lot of people. They mainly go to a very, very, small group of poor people. And of course, they're going to gain a stigma there. But if you create a different kind of benefit that's not exclusive to the poor, then, odds are it's not going to have the same kind of stigma. And so I think the new child tax credit fits that mold as a very clear welfare benefit, check every month in your account, but not a poor people benefit. And it's the first time we've done that in, decades and decades and decades.
Sorry, I think I was muted for a second. There's some statistics that says something like, 90%, over 90% of Americans will receive some sort of government benefit in their lifetime. And that's any government benefit across the board. Obviously, for lots of people, that's Social Security. But because so many of these benefits, with the exception of Social Security and now this CTC, have been tied up in the tax code in these really obscure, kind of non-obvious ways, lots of people don't even realize they're getting help from the government. I mean, when you get your tax refund back, that's just oh, cool, that was my money or whatever. So I think that your point about, an actual check that is coming to people that they can see, that is a really good thing.
Yeah, absolutely. They used to, Suzanne Mettler has a phrase for this, the submerged state. And part of the justification for that was, people don't want to feel like they're getting benefits. So you kind of got to trick them into getting benefits. And then also, to kind of trick conservatives as well, so that they, if you can kind of pitch it as a tax cut, it might be a bit more sellable to them. But yeah, and I mean, like I said, I think that rationale, what they failed to account for in all this is they would look to benefits that were poor people benefits. They would look to things like food stamps or WIC or school lunch or Medicaid to some degree, and and then extrapolate from there. And in the American context, maybe that's just kind of, you feel like that's all you can do, and so you say, well, we need to try something else, but. In other contexts, it's like, if you really want to test this theory, we need to put out a benefit that is not exclusive to poor people and see if that same kind of stigma attaches. And I don't know, I hope that that won't be the case here. It's kind of hard to imagine that it would, with 90% of kids getting it.
Not to get you off on a tangent about the Nordic states, which I know, of course, is your other interest, but I mean, their kind of system would seem to suggest that you do destigmatize social services when they are available to a wider number of people, right?
Absolutely, yeah. And I mean, they've had a monthly child benefit. I think Sweden was the first one to kick it off in like 1915 or something like that. Like, they've had this for over 100 years. And yeah, people like the welfare state there. It's so beloved that they've kind of made it their international brand. Like we go out and talk about our great, tech companies and innovation, and they want to tell you about their baby boxes and stuff like that.
Right. Yeah. So I want to go back to the CTC, because in your piece, you do mention that the new CTC, for all of its kind of advantages that we just talked about, it was billed as something that would finally get benefits to the poorest people. And you mentioned that it doesn't actually do that. And you don't spend a ton of time like kind of unpacking that in the piece. So I'm wondering if you can talk about why the benefits still aren't getting to the poorest of the poor, and what kind of changes would need to happen to make sure that they're getting those benefits.
Yeah, so I wrote a lot of pieces about this when the bill was being passed, and I've written many since it's been passed. And the basic problem here is we had this old child tax credit, and the way it worked is at the end of the year when you filed your taxes, they would look at how much income you had, and you'd get a certain benefit based on that. And the old benefit, it didn't go to poor people, of course. If you don't file taxes, you didn't get anything, and if your income wasn't high enough for the credit to take effect, you didn't get anything either. So the old design was meant to not go to poor people. And instead of saying, oh, hey, we're creating kind of a whole new benefit here that we do plan to go to poor people, let's rethink how we're doing this, they just said, we can kind of graft this on to the existing child tax credit program and just say, hey, if you don't file taxes, it's okay, you're still eligible. But the problem then becomes, okay, yeah, you're eligible, but how do you get the benefit? If you file taxes, they have your bank account number. They just put it in your account. I got some in my account. I didn't do anything to get it. If you don't file taxes, they don't have any information like that. So now non-filers, people who are too poor to file taxes, they have to now jump through a really considerable set of hoops to try to get this benefit, and they haven't been able to. And as I was saying, when they were debating this bill, it was very predictable that they were not going to be able to do that. As far as like what to do about it, my proposal from the beginning was, let's have the Social Security Administration send this check out, just like they send out checks to some 70 million elderly and disabled people each month. And they actually send out checks, people don't know this, to about 3.5 million children each month, because you are eligible for benefits if you're a disabled child or your parents die or something like that. And that would have made it much easier to get. There are 1,500 Social Security offices around the country. People enroll in Social Security as soon as they're born, literally at the hospital. Their kids are put in it, and they get a Social Security number. So I thought that was a much more natural home for it. That's not where they went with it. So now the question, they're probably not going to switch it over. So what can you do now? One, enroll kids at birth. Two, hire some people to go out and try to find these people. Three, even though the Social Security Administration is not administering the benefit, and state welfare offices aren't, you could probably work with those offices to at least make it possible to sign up through them, because they have thousands and thousands of locations across the country. Right now, the only way to get it, if you're a non-filer, you have to go through this website. And very poor people, half of them don't even have computers at their home, and the website sucks, and there's all sorts of problems with it. So, Yeah, basically trying to roll it out as close as you can to my initial proposal by kind of allowing the existing welfare institutions where poor people do interact, where they do go sign up for food stamps and do sign up to get their disability checks. Try to make it as similar to that as possible. That's what I'm proposing, and they are going to have to make it permanent here in the next month or so with this new reconciliation bill. And I know there are people in Congress like Senator Brown and certainly Senator Sanders who are trying to make changes so that it will become more practical for very poor people to sign up. But I don't know if how that's going to shake out.
So I think this is our last question for you, and then we will let you go back to People's Policy Project. But I was wondering, just again on the subject of kind of this divide or like this difference between so-called poor people benefits and welfare benefits. Do you see any other current poor people benefits that have the potential to be turned into kind of more general or larger welfare benefits over, let's say, the course of the Biden administration? And then the very last question, which I think kind of follows from that, and this is a little bit broad, so like answer how you want. Do you think this is the end, or do you think this is the beginning, at least, of the end of welfare reform?
Yeah, so on the first question, just speaking practically based on, the kind of things Biden might do, the most obvious benefit is school lunch. Right now, for a long time, you could only get school lunch if your income was below a certain percentage of the poverty line or something like that. And then in the Obama administration, they made it to where if your school had enough poor people in it or your school district had enough poor people in it, they just gave it to everyone in those schools without checking. And that was, an okay step. And then for the last year or two, they've been giving it to pretty much all kids because of the pandemic. And they started giving people EBT cards because kids weren't going to school. So like for the last year or two, we've had sort of like universal free school lunch. And, that seems like something you could make permanent. It's pretty small. It doesn't cost all that much. So that would be the most practical thing, within the confines of we have a moderate president and, moderate Senate and all that. Mm-hmm. As far as the end of welfare reform, it's an interesting question. What they should have done in 1996 when they got rid of aid to families with dependent children is they should have created a child allowance that just went out to everyone, because the main problem with that old program was if you tried to work or earn any money, you would lose all those benefits, and that created a lot of problems for people. People wanted to work, they wanted to make more money, and then they couldn't, and they kind of got in this welfare trap. And so replacing it with something like this is what they should have done in 96, and now they've done it, and it looks like they might make it permanent. So in that narrow sense, yes. Have we gotten sort of religion on universal benefits more generally? One thing to look at on that is this new reconciliation bill. In it, they're going to try to do like child care benefits and paid leave benefits and things like that. And so it'll be interesting to see if they design those in a way that's similar to like the new CTC, or if it's still the old garbage. And so far it looks like it's just the old garbage. So we'll see.
Well, the other thing that I think about, of course, when I think about welfare reform is work requirements. And luckily, like nobody, so far as I know, like found some way to graft those onto the child tax credit. Although, as you point out, because of course it is through the tax code, that implies that you need some sort of income. But I'm wondering, just as a follow-up, like, do you see work requirements? I mean, they're an issue again, of course, because, now Republicans want to kick people off unemployment. And I'm just wondering if you see any opportunities or any space for progress to be made in that area. I mean, I think that like Democrats now, actually, you tell me, do Democrats now, and not just Bernie Sanders, but like Democrats, like generally agree that, that work requirements didn't work then and don't work now in terms of getting people back into the workforce?
I don't know. I think most, especially thinking in the policy world, most people think that these phased in benefits we had, like the old child tax credit and the current earned income tax credit, that it does encourage people to work more because, the more you work, the more benefit you get. But it's weird because they're very all over the map on this, and it really kind of depends on the personalities involved. So like, when Trump was in office, of course, the Republicans, every time they're in office, they try to attach more work requirements to food stamps and Medicaid.
Right.
And the Democrats were furious about this. Oh, my God, you're going to throw all these poor people off their health insurance just because they can't get a job. What if they can't find a job? Even if they can't, whatever, like they're still sick. There was like this big kind of thing. And then you turn around and you say, well, we should get rid of the earned income tax credit. It's pretty much the same kind of thing. If you can't get work, you can't get the earned income tax credit. We should. They don't want to hear that,
right?
And so it's sort of like, well, wait, which is it? Which one do we? What do we want to attach this to or not? And then with unemployment insurance, right now all the GOP states have gotten rid of the extra unemployment benefits. They got rid of them in the last month. And the Democratic states, they're all going to get rid of them on September 6th. That's the schedule. And the Biden administration could have stopped the Republican states from cutting some of the unemployment benefits. The way the statute was set out, they did not. It actually obligates the Labor Department to pay these benefits. And Biden could have tried to do something to get around that and administer it directly, and he just chose not to. And it seems like they kind of are buying into this idea that unemployment benefits are holding employment back. So, they'll probably let those expire on September 6th. And I had a piece up in Jacobin just yesterday saying there's 20 million people who live in households that are going to lose those benefits at September 6th, and it does not look like they're all going to be reemployed in that in the next 40 days. So.
Right. Yeah. Well, Matt, we definitely will have to have you back on at some point for another state of the welfare state. Again, Matt Bruenig, the founder and president of the People's Policy Project. Go check out his work in Jacobin and also on the 3P website. Matt, thanks very much.
Thank you.
All right. So just want to quickly mention that we will be getting to Marianne Williamson very soon. I know you're all waiting to hear from her, as am I. But first, I think we are going to just take a couple of LaborPaul questions. LaborPaul, of course, is our segment where you submit questions to our resident labor expert, Paul, and he will take a couple. I think for the last couple of episodes, we've had labor guests on, so we haven't been able to answer questions. So we have got a few this week. So let's see. So the first one we have, I think we have two questions, and they come from a reader or a viewer, Alex Day, who writes, should shop stewards, or as they are called in my union, which is the Berkeley Federation of Teachers, site representatives, be paid a yearly stipend? What are the pros and cons from a rank and file perspective?
All right. Well, first, let me apologize to Alex. I'm an old man that doesn't know how to use Twitter. So Alex posted this question on Twitter a while ago, and I just got around to seeing it. But I'll start by backing up and talking about what a shop steward is. I'm going to take a little detour, then come back to the question. So you might hear different names for it. Like in my teachers union, we call them building reps. But shop stewards are the main point of contact for the union on the shop floor and in the work site. They are workers just like everyone else. They don't get paid by the union, but they are elected by their fellow workers to represent them against management. And I think shop stewards are the most important people in labor unions. And I'll even go a step further and maybe be a little bit dramatic and think they are one of the most important political positions, period. And I say this because they are the most upfront and intimate representative of the union for workers. If you're in a big union local, you may not often see the president of your local. Staff organizers, you may only see on a limited basis. But a shop steward works side by side with you every day and is the first person you should go to with a problem. So shop stewards are in charge of handling grievances. So if your manager violates a contract, maybe it can be as simple as the shop steward has a quick talk with management and the issue is resolved. Or maybe it goes further and a shop steward leads an arbitration with management. Or let's say you decide to take a collective action. You all decide to wear a union sticker or a union button one day. The shop steward should be the person coordinating that. They are crucial in the chain of communication and mobilization within a union. And so it can be very rewarding work. And let's look at what some shop stewards from Teamsters Local 728 talked about what they do.
I mean, it empowers me. It empowers me to help empower others.
Oh, it's so rewarding. It's so rewarding just to know that people have someone they can depend on. Whenever they call me, I always follow through. They don't have to worry about if I'm going to get back to them or not. And we do whatever we need to do in order to bring humility into the workplace. Whatever is wrong, We use the CBA as our handbook to have it resolved.
They have concerns, or sometimes they just want to vent. They might not even want to do the whole process. They just might want to just talk and get it off their chest.
Well, it makes you feel proud to be a part of something that's quite as big as the International Brotherhood of Teamsters.
I love it. It makes me feel good because my gift as a human being is to help people.
It makes me feel good, especially when I give somebody a member my number and they call me, they text me and they tell me thank you.
Absolutely awesome. It gives me a sense of purpose.
Empowered makes me feel good to see people have less stress in the way they do their job.
Oh, I love it. I love helping people out. I love what I do.
I am empowered because I am a Teamster, and I'm so thankful.
It's the most rewarding job that you ever can have.
It's my passion to help people, whether on or off the job. I'm excited to be able to help my peers.
So it makes me feel good to be a Teamster and also a steward.
So let's go back to the question. Should shop stewards get paid an extra stipend for it? I think it's an interesting question. On the one hand, you could say it is a lot of extra work, and anyone that is a good shop steward knows that they put in a lot of extra work, and they should be compensated for their labor. But I actually may lean towards no, that they shouldn't necessarily get paid an extra stipend. You want people running for shop steward who care the most about building the union and representing their fellow coworkers. You don't want it to turn into something where people want to grab the position and hold on to it for material comfort and privileges. And now some people might hear that and think, well, what about union presidents and officials? Should they get paid extra? And I think that kind of opens up another can of worms. I think there are some union leaders that definitely have a bloated outsized salary, especially when compared to how much the workers they represent make. Sometimes, though much less often than the media wants you to believe, that kind of thing can lead to corruption and stagnant bureaucracy. But having said that, there probably are some locals out there that might pay shop stewards a stipend. I don't think that would be the end of the world. I don't think that would inherently mean a bad thing happen. But I might lean towards thinking that, shop stewards should be doing this on a voluntary basis. But if you are watching and you are in a union, you should consider running to be a shop steward. It's incredibly important and rewarding work, just like the people in those video were saying. And it's probably the most important work anyone on the left can be doing right now. Or if you just joined the union, try to find out who your shop steward is and talk to them. And I think we have a follow-up question that is closely related by the same person. We want to throw that one up. Oh, I think Jen's on mute.
Sorry about that, guys. I just want to say before we get to the next question that I just really liked watching that video of people talking about how proud they are to be shop stewards. And it made me think, that's what bosses wish customer service representatives would be like. I just really love helping people. But obviously you're not going to get that level of actual commitment and pride from something that your boss is forcing you to do. That can only come from being a shop steward. So I echo what you said. If you are in a union, look into being a shop steward. All right, so sorry. For the second part of the question, the same person asks, follow up, what are the pros and cons from a rank and file perspective on full-time versus part-time paid organizers? By part-time, I mean that an educator might get a partial release from 25% to 50% of their duty day to do paid organizing for their local.
This is another good question. So, all unions need some full-time staff organizers, whether it's for organizing a new workplace or representing current members. There's just too much work to be done overall to rely just on part-time people. But having said that, I absolutely think that if unions can do it, they should release current union members part-time to do organizing work. Because often these workers are more effective than the staff organizers, even if the staff organizer is great. They intimately know the job and the workers. So workers sometimes trust them more than a random staff organizer that might come out of a university. And often there are a lot of little details about problems in the workplace that an actual worker will know. So for example, we can all know that teachers would like to get paid more, but actual teachers will know that sometimes our coworkers get more fired up about things like class size or about having functioning copy machines or having enough time to pee. Sometimes those are the real issues that might be better basis to start organizing on. And a worker will know that, and probably better than anyone else. So I think part-time release worker organizers help members see the union as something that they are a part of, not as something that's apart from them. Because often, we try to say in the labor movement, you are the union. Many workers, and sometimes they have good reasons for doing this, they talk about the union as an other. Like, well, the union will do this, will do that, and not really thinking about themselves as being the core part of the union. The Communication Workers of America is a great example of a union that does this. We recently had on Les Leopold, who spoke about the Runaway Inequality Political Education Training Program, and they use workers to do that training. And these workers get, release time from their job to be organizers and to do these trainings. So instead of some professor coming and talking about these challenging issues, it's better to have people the workers know and can relate to better doing it. So in conclusion, yes, I think, we do need full-time staff organizers, but I think when unions can do it, workers should absolutely be released to do part-time organizing as well.
I guess I want to follow that up by asking, do you think that there are certain qualities that make someone better suited to be a shop steward or an organizer? And I ask that not because I don't think that anyone could do it if, they felt inclined to do it, but those are hard jobs. And I mean, when you, even just watching the video of the people talking about how much they enjoy being shop stewards, you have to really like people. I think that you have to like being kind of a broker or like a problem solver. I'm sorry, these are like businessy terms. And I feel uncomfortable using them about like unions. But I guess what I'm saying is like some people are sort of, I think, have a kind of natural aptitude for the work of organizing. And again, this is not to say that everybody can't do it. But I'm just wondering, from your perspective, like I think actually Jane McAlevey has a term for it in a labor setting or in the workplace. There are some people who I think she calls organic leaders. And I actually don't know if she says that these are the best people to be shop stewards. Like they might be suited for other things. And we'll get her back on at some point to clarify. But here and now, what do you think are the qualities that, like, I don't know, people should be looking out for?
Yeah, that's a good point. And maybe I should amend what I say. Not necessarily everyone just go out and be a shop steward. I think you should really want to do it. But I think definitely what you said, like wanting to like people, have some leadership qualities, liking to solve problems or help people out. You don't necessarily have to be the loudest person in the room. And I think one of the things Jane talks about with organic leaders or real leaders, and it might kind of sound paradoxical, but often these people are very good workers. And it might sound like, oh, wait, doesn't mean you're stuck up to the boss, but like, workers on the job, respect them. They look up to them. They do their job well. I think those people are well suited to be shop stewards or in some kind of leadership position because they have respect of people around them. It's not, some people might assume like the person that complains the most is actually usually not the leader, and they actually might be quite unpopular with their coworkers. I think anyone who's worked a job can relate to that. So I think those are some of the qualities. And I think a lot of times Jane talks about it in the context of like a new organizing drive when you don't quite have a union yet, identifying the leader. But we should have her on. But I think those same people would do very well in the position of shop steward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's funny that you mentioned the kind of anecdote about like the loudest person or like the most like confrontational person in the room or in the workplace, because a few years ago when the kind of like media unionizing, like I don't know, sort of like energy was starting to bubble up. I just went to a kind of like general, I wasn't working in media at the time, but I was interested in what was going on. So I went to a kind of general meeting where a union rep was talking to different media workers about like how they could start unionizing. And she was like, so if you think about your workplace, obviously in the early stages of an organizing campaign, like things are very, like you have to keep things like pretty secret, like you really have to start, you don't want the bosses catching wind of the fact that you're trying to organize. So she was like, the union rep was like, so who is the person that you would want to bring into your campaign early on? Is it the person who, keeps their head down and just like does good work and, doesn't make waves in the office? Or is it the person who's like who complains a lot and is like always arguing with the boss and is just like super out there, and like you just know that they've got problems with the office? And almost every single person chose that person, because I think that in a way it kind of is like, oh well, like they're already fired up about like workplace issues. But this is all just to underscore that I think, sometimes it can be a little counterintuitive, or sometimes the qualities that make a good shop steward or a good organizer in the early stages of a campaign are not actually the same as the person who is like the loudest on the picket line, or like who's a good rabble rouser, who might be great in a different context. But so that's why I asked.
Right. Yeah. That's exactly right.
Yeah.
So should we introduce our guest?
Our guest of the hour, one and only Marianne Williamson.
All right,
Hi.
Let me give a proper introduction. So Marianne Williamson, as I'm sure everyone knows, ran for president in 2020. She's the founder of Project Angel Food, the co-founder of Peace Alliance, and the author of 13 books, including in 2019, the book A Politics of Love, a handbook for a new American revolution. Welcome, Marianne.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
So I wanted to start with a question I think that you can speak to very well. And this is something I think that many of us on the left, whether you identify as a socialist or not, care about, and that is alienation. So many people in this country are deeply alienated, whether that's alienated from politics, from their jobs, from each other, from society as a whole. So what do you think is the root causes of this sort of alienation, and how do we fight it or overcome it?
Well, for the last 40 years, there's been an ever shrinking number of people who stand a reasonable chance of actualizing their dreams in this country. And that hope that we can work and that it can produce something and that we can build connections with people and that we can make our dreams come true, that's what makes us feel we're part of a larger fabric of a society. What has happened particularly over the last 40 years, not that I'm romanticizing American society or capitalism or anything like that before 40 years ago, but over the last 40 years particularly, there has been such a specific and systemic rigging of the system, including a massive transfer of wealth into the hands of a very small group of people. And this has decimated some of the pillars of our democracy and of our sense of possibility for the vast majority of Americans. This has had a devastating effect. This has had a devastating effect because it has thrown so many people into a kind of economic survival mode, not knowing what they'll do if they get sick or if their children get sick, not knowing how they'll send their kids to college, not being able to have enough bandwidth and time to spend with their spouses, with their children, with their families, forcing both people to work even when it wasn't a situation where both parents wanted to work, but where both people had to work. None of those conditions were endemic of our society before the 1980s. And this has created alienation because it has destroyed the bonds of human relationship. People don't have enough time to be part of their community. They don't have enough time to be politically active. They don't have enough time to spend with their children, with their loved ones, to build relationships, to have vacations. So there has been a growing sense among people, which is legitimate, that this society doesn't give a about me, that I'm just trying to survive here. Now that's very, very different than, for instance, when I grew up. We've never been perfect. We've never been a society that has manifest our purported ideals, certainly for people of color, etc. There's no doubt about that. However, there was a sense in my own lifetime that we were at least trying for that goal. And there was a sense that efforts to make it happen would not be as systemically obstructed as they are now. So now there is such hopelessness, and there is so much rage, and there is so much despair, most of which I feel is very legitimate, and I understand it, and I recognize that we better fix that, or there's going to be a chaos in the society unlike anything we've ever seen.
So I want to follow that up by asking, so you, of course, in 2020, ran in the Democratic presidential primary, but much like Bernie Sanders, who also ran, you were both very fierce and outspoken critics of a lot of the Democratic Party elite, a lot of mainstream centrist Democrats. And, when we think about politics today, there are quite a few would-be voters who are turned off, not just by Democrats, but Republicans as well. Especially working class voters, I think, are very turned off by partisan politics these days. So this is a difficult and broad question, but do you see a path for sort of moving beyond partisan politics in the US right now?
There is a tyranny of limited conversation. There is a very narrow-minded approach to living and a very narrow-minded approach to politics that is cast upon us. It is imposed upon us. It comes from the media. It comes from the political parties. And, none of it has to do with where people really live. It doesn't have to do with where people live in terms of the policies that it addresses. It doesn't have to do with where people really live in terms of, I believe, the nobility and the dignity and the decency that we're capable of. One of the things that I learned when I ran for office is that when you actually talk to the voters, the American people are far more open to a conversation that moves beyond all that narrowness. People are open to depth. People are hungry for depth. People are hungry for meaning. And yet most people running, most traditional politicians, don't give them that. So if we want to move beyond that, we have to forge a new and a different conversation. In education, there is a concept of trauma-informed education. There is now a realization that so many children have had what's called adverse childhood experiences. We understand that there's so many traumatized children, and our educational institutions have grown to accept that, embrace that, and try to accommodate that reality. It's not just children who are traumatized in this society. Adults are traumatized in this society. We don't just need trauma-informed education, we need a trauma-informed politics. We need a politics that speaks to that alienation that we were talking about. We need a politics that speaks with empathy and soulfulness to the deep pain that people are in, living with chronic economic tension and anxiety every day of their lives, what it has done to them, what it has done to their bodies, what it has done to their relationships. So the partisan conversation is dead. It is meaningless. I know it's everywhere. I know it's ubiquitous, but it contains within it no living spirit. There's a new conversation that is ready to emerge. And I believe, and I feel even more of this having run for president, the people are ready for it. Let's remember, when it comes to politics in America, the people are not the problem. Mm-hmm. The people are not the problem. If you look at poll after poll, where the American people actually come down on issues, we've got 70% of Americans actually want Medicare for all. We have over, I think something like we have a high percentage of Republicans. I don't know exactly what it is. I don't remember, but a high percentage of Republicans. I always remind people, this is a country that in 2000, actually the people elected Al Gore. This is the problem. I have been in too many audiences, including people who were there to listen to a political candidate, who have absolutely convinced me that if people were actually given the real scoop of what's going on, people are not stupid. You speak to their nobility, they'll be noble. You speak to their dignity, they'll be dignified. You speak to their decency, they will be that. We could have this constituency of conscience and consciousness and depth, but our politicians don't speak to that because that's not where they feel the votes are. And we need to simply move on and create a new conversation.
I would say I completely agree with that. And, the points that you were making about trauma and alienation, I think ring very true as well. But I suppose my question is, all of that can often feel overwhelming, right? The injustice that we face or that we're confronted with today can often feel insurmountable. And you, of course, continue to be very active politically. I know that recently you've been championing progressive politicians like Nina Turner. You're, of course, also working closely with advocates like Stephen Donziger, who's fighting Chevron. So just for you personally, how how do you decide where and how to dedicate your time and energy?
Every cell in the body is assigned. Some cells are assigned to the bones, and some cells are assigned to the pancreas, and some cells are assigned to the heart, some cells are assigned to the blood. Within all natural systems, there is some level of natural intelligence. And just as the cells of the body are assigned to where they can best be of use, I think that we all, in the depth of our being, it's what in the Eastern religions is called dharma, feel called. Some people feel called to science. Some people feel called to the arts. Some people feel called to the healing arts. And I think all of us really do feel called to some level of collective political involvement. We do feel called. We just can't find a way to express that. The answer to your question, quite simply, is that I meditate. I am a woman of faith, and I think that it is worth noting that the left wing almost aversion today to a spiritual conversation, except within very narrow confines, is an aberration. A lot of the abolitionist movement was grounded in the early evangelicals in New Hampshire. Many of the women who were leaders of the women's suffragette movement were Quakers. And Dr. King, of course, was a Baptist preacher. The greatest social justice movements have been born of a consciousness that anything is possible. That's what faith gives you. Faith gives you a visceral sense that, as we all know the line, the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. We are going to get there. We are going to get there. And America, the history of the United States is not that we have never swerved from the angels of our better nature, God knows, between slavery and segregation and institutionalized suppression of women and genocide of Native Americans. Lord knows we've had many, many transgressions against the principles on which we purport to stand. But our history is that over time, we do tend to self-correct. Generations rise up. Generations rise up and they push back at the undemocratic forces. And I believe that as important as it is to identify our problems, this is a time for us to identify with the problem solvers. Identify with, well, the abolitionists did it, and the women's suffragettes did it, and the civil rights movement did it, and damn it, we're going to do it. And you live in that space and you claim that space. And I believe that it is a level of moral and spiritual conviction that gives you a sense that that moral arc does always bend. How long it takes will have to do with how we act and what we make happen. And I know for those of us who are older, you don't necessarily have a sense it's all going to happen in your lifetime, but you're going to have the satisfaction of dying knowing that you did what you could while you were here. And you get to an age where that matters a lot.
I wish I had a better transition, but this topic is not very spiritual, but talking about the Biden administration now. So some of the left, in the early days, we might have been a little bit pleasantly surprised at the Biden administration, the willingness to spend big in a way, adopt some of the ideas that leftists have been putting out there. But now the infrastructure bill seems really stalled. It's unclear what kind of big initiatives might come in the future, if any at all. I mean, what's your assessment overall of the Biden administration so far? And what do you think needs to be done going forward in this first term?
We were all just so excited that Trump was no longer in the White House. Mm-hmm. And it is to be celebrated that we have interrupted that particular trajectory of neo-fascist authoritarian dictator consciousness in the White House. So we were all very excited about that. Then we were all very excited to see, hey, put FDR's picture over the mantle in the Oval Office, and he talks about FDR. They're talking about going big. And he has done some things on a domestic level, certainly, that we can all be happy about. Lena Khan being appointed to head the FTC, Jonathan Cantor at the DOJ on antitrust, his whole idea that monopolies are a problem and he's going after them. Well, that's really good. There's stuff in his proposed infrastructure bill that any of us can be happy about. Pre-K, universal pre-K, and universal childcare, and paid family leave, and extending the child credit, all of that's good. But in that area, as in most every area, even when they're getting it right, my fear is that we're talking too little, too slow, and too late. These are things that should have been done 30 years ago, things that should have been done 35 years ago. At this point, the situation is so dire for so many millions of people that we need a massive infusion of economic hope and opportunity. We should be talking at least about a $15 an hour minimum wage. We should be talking about Medicare for all. We should be talking about a Green New Deal. We should be talking, and Joe, Joe Biden, sometimes when I say we should be talking about them, sometimes he does talk about them. It's time for us to say to the president, thank you for talking about it. Now, would you please do something about it? Don't just talk to me about how corporate taxes should be raised. Let's see some real action. And then also on the foreign policy level, I find him an extreme disappointment. I'm extremely disappointed at the Yemeni blockade, Saudi Arabians. I'm disappointed by all the sanctions, whether it has to do with Cuba or Venezuela or maximum pressure sanctions in Iran. So I find it kind of creepy the way, and you see this with the Nina Turner race versus the Chantel Brown race, that in order to be a good Democrat, you're supposed to line up with Biden no matter what he says. That's no different than people saying that in order to be a good Republican, you need to line up with whatever Trump says. So I think it's time for us, there was a time in my lifetime where liberals, progressives, the left in general, was acknowledged as a significant part of the political conversation. Now, we're not just being kicked out by the right, we're being kicked out by the Democratic Party. And it does something to your head, doesn't it? Like, where are you supposed to go? And I think that's why we have to stick together and know that the container will grow around us as we just continue to coalesce and articulate a conversation that is higher, that is sustainable, and that is healthy for our society, and have faith that more and more people will hear us. And no, it's not the neoliberalism of Joe Biden, even when he does something which we can be grateful for, give him credit for, and celebrate, which I certainly do.
And you write and talk a lot about violence and peace, both in a geopolitical sense, but also even in an interpersonal sense. And the United States is a very violent country, I think it's fair to say. And you can see this not just in our foreign interventions by the military, but in our out-of-control gun violence, whether that's in urban areas and rural areas. What is it about our society and culture that allows this violence to be so pervasive?
Most of the time, violence is rooted in someone's despair and someone's rage and someone's sense of hopelessness. So I look at violence like I look at all these mental health issues that people talk about. What do you do about it? Stop driving people crazy. That which you do, which helps people thrive, helps people find the peace in their hearts. We know that poverty is so much at the root of the violence in society. We can talk about the historical legacy of violence stemming from the beginning of our founding. That is true. But what we can deal with, in addition to reckoning with our past, is reckoning with our present. We can see how so much of the increased violence stems from the war on drugs, stemmed from flooding particular neighborhoods, particularly disadvantaged neighborhoods, particularly neighborhoods of color, not only with drugs, but also with guns. And I think that there isn't a disconnection between personal violence and externalized violence. People on the left are as emotionally and psychologically violent as people on the right. If you look at the way people behave on social media, emotional violence is violence. Lying about people is violence. Mocking people is violence. Judging people when you don't even know what you're talking about is violence. All of us could use some greater personal and interpersonal maturity. If we want a new politics, we have to learn how to debate honorably with people with whom we do not agree. So a lot of the violence is among people and between and among people who basically agree with each other on issues. And then we're talking about how the right is so violent. They talk about guns, but when other people over on this side talking about guillotines, I know, well, I don't worry about that. They don't really mean it literally. Well, my conservative friends don't know that they don't mean it literally. So I think that peace does begin inside the heart. You know, Gandhi said that the end is inherent in the means. The traditional political perspective is the end justifies the means. But the philosophy of nonviolence, the political philosophy of nonviolence, as articulated by Gandhi and Dr. King, is that the end is inherent in the means. So if we ourselves do not learn how to be nonviolent, we will not be conduits. We will not be those who can transmit the energies that will create a nonviolent world. So it does have to begin with us. And it begins with us and our own personal relationships, including our personal relationships regarding politics.
So, you know, you had mentioned social media, and something I really wanted to ask you was, you know, obviously you are a national figure, you're a best-selling author, you have almost 100K subscribers on YouTube, I believe, and of course you've just launched, or you have been the host of your own podcast. But you've also spoken, I think, really compellingly about what it was like to be sidelined or even smeared by the mainstream media while you were on the campaign trail. And I guess the question is, what do you think the role of, you know, so-called alternative media can play in advancing progressive politics today? And I actually ask quite a few guests this question because it's kind of a conundrum, right? Like on the one hand, you have a huge platform, but on the other hand, you know, you and Bernie Sanders and many other people who are part of the left are still fighting to be heard in some way on by mainstream media. Does it matter?
I think that independent media is everything right now. The Telecommunications Act in 1996, which was passed by a Democratic president, Bill Clinton, so corporatized. This is what it corporatized the media. This is what created what we call today the mainstream media. These are corporate entities that are serving their own short-term profit. That's what they're serving before they're serving any journalistic standards of ethics and educative function in the society. The only place where you see the real pillars, not the only place, there are people working within mainstream media who are making the effort, and some of whom I met and felt treated me fairly during the campaign. But for the most part, what I saw very closely is that there is a political media industrial complex, and truth-telling is not their bottom line. At all. Exploiting and manipulating the masses with whatever message they feel would either gain them power or wealth is what the game is that is being played. So the real journalistic lights in our society today are in the independent media. And that's what is so extremely important. That's why all of us are holding so strongly on this idea of censorship, net neutrality, and so forth. Will it get us anywhere? Absolutely, it will get us somewhere, because ultimately social change does not occur along a horizontal axis. Social change ultimately occurs on a vertical axis. What do I mean by that? If you're just trying to get power or change the society by getting more and more people to agree with you, then you're willing to dumb down your message or manipulate the message or do whatever you feel you need to do in order to get more clicks or more voters. If what you're dedicated to is telling the truth as best you can, it's vertical. And ultimately, society moves in the direction of the deeper truth. So I think people need to be less concerned about the majority. The majority, the status quo does not disrupt itself, ever. The majority didn't wake up one day and say, let's end slavery, shall we? The majority didn't wake up one day and say, I have an idea, let's give women the right to vote. That's not how social change occurs. It changes because enough people, a critical mass of people, usually considered outliers and outrageous radicals by the status quo of their time, which was always thought, have a better idea, and they stand on it, and they stand on it with conviction. Conviction is a force multiplier. And the problem we have today is that haters are so convicted. The problem we have today is that bigots are so convicted. The problem that we have today is that racists are so convicted. The problem that we have today is that anti-Semites are so convicted. We have to stand together and remember how many of us there really are, both in terms of the polls, in terms of people like yourselves, and all of us. There's so many voices out there. We're there. We know each other. This is there. We have to stand on what we know and practice what we know, and just remember this is This is resonating. We're building a field of energy. Now, if I want to think only in material terms, then I could go into the same place of despair that many understandably go into now, which is, but how are we going to do it? The Democratic Party, look what they did to Bernie in 2016. Look what they did to Bernie in 2020. God knows I know how it works, but it doesn't matter. So if I was in the belly of that beast and saw what happens when a Tom Perez of the world says, get that woman off the stage, and 3 days later, the lies about you, the same lies, the same talking points are everywhere you look. If I can still say, doesn't matter, let's just keep going. Because we took an inch. On any given day, and I know you feel that way about your own work, you got an inch of ground today. And somebody else got an inch of ground today. And somebody else got an inch of ground today. And somebody else wrote an article. And somebody else had a podcast. And somebody else did something. I know it. I can feel it in my gut. And we're going to get there. Because I do believe, and I think that the majority of Americans believe, that something about what this country is founded on is important. And we don't want it to go down. The world would not be a better place if it went down. And there are enough of us to feel deep commitment that we're going to do what we can, that it will not go down on our watch.
I'm actually really glad you said that, because before you came on, we started the episode by talking a little bit about is the left in a little bit of a lull after 2020? I think the answer is yes. But I think that you have provided an actually kind of inspiring response to that. So
Good. You just have to keep going. It's I once heard a phrase, I don't know who said it, but it's a marvelous phrase that has really guided me: to be fully invested in an effort and unattached to the outcome. Just be invested in the effort, and what it looks like and when it happens, we can't know. But we just keep putting one foot in front of the other each and every day. Do what you can. If today you are taken by the Assange issue, or today you're taken by an environmental issue, or today you're taken by a sex trafficking issue, or today you're taken by a racial justice issue, or today you're taken by an electoral issue, or today you're taken by a Stephen Donziger issue, whatever it is, whatever's in front of you, whatever you saw online, how can you amplify it? How can you add to the power? How can you add to the energy? It's like if you look at a great athlete, that's what makes an athlete great. If you look at, let's say, a great tennis player. Let's say a great tennis player drops a ball and it's some dumb move that a mistake they haven't made since they were 12 years old. During the game, they don't have time to say, oh shit. They don't have time. You just gotta keep going. And that's how we have to be. We do not have the time to indulge anger. We do not have the time to indulge immaturity. We do not have the time to indulge despair. We don't have the time to do anything other than just keep going. And you cry when you have to cry, and you get upset for an hour or so when you need to get upset. You go through whatever you had to go through. I know about that. I know about how you have to heal from all that sometimes because it's painful. And then you get up and you put on your best whatever, and you go out there, and you know that you weren't born to be held down.
This might have to be our last question, but you became active in the anti-Vietnam War movement in the 1970s, and I think some on the
60s,
left,
actually.
60s and 70s, and I think some on the left sometimes might romanticize the movements of the 60s and 70s a little bit, and not totally without reason. But how would you kind of assess the strengths and weaknesses of the social movements of that era? And I kind of look at that as the last era, the last real American left with size and influence before what's growing today. How would you assess those movements as compared to what's been bubbling up today?
In what way do you feel it's been over-romanticized or romanticized at all?
Well, I think sometimes in popular culture and movies, like the story that's told is, as always with popular culture, not really as much depth as what really took place. Or I think there's a lot of times a romanticization of what happened and then leaving out then what happened afterwards, and then how are we in this current place from that,
I actually don't feel it's romanticized. I think it is something to look at. Young people sometimes have said to me, oh, You know, your generation, you're all about drugs, sex, and rock and roll. My answer to that is always, that was just part of the day. The other part of the day, we stopped the war. We stopped the war. And for that matter, the sex, drugs, and rock and roll, I know some people who could use more sex, drugs, and rock and roll. They could use more of the cultural and personal revolution that goes along with the political revolution that fuels it. And that was a sense there. You know, we read Ram Dass in the morning and went to anti-war protests in the afternoon. And there was not a sense, I feel so sorry for young people today, because we did not feel, we knew that the system was rigged, but we didn't feel that it was unriggable. And it wasn't. We did stop the war. There was civil rights legislation passed. There was voting rights legislation passed. That was in that era. It was in this era that the Voting Rights Act was gutted. Now, it was during that time and in response to all that, yes, very romantic effort on the part of a generation, that a very serious effort was begun to decimate the American left. Like you said, it all fell apart. Well, they killed our leaders. They killed our leaders and in front of our eyes. They killed Martin Luther King in front of our eyes. They killed Bobby Kennedy in front of our eyes. They killed, and just in case we hadn't gotten the message, they killed those students at Kent State in front of our eyes. Talk about trauma. Talk about PTSD. It was a silent message, but very loud, because we knew intended for all of us, there will be no further protest. You can do whatever you want in the private sector, leave the public sector alone. Leave it to the hands of whoever it is that wants to control it so badly that they will kill in order to do so. That's what we did. That's what many people did. We knew they might kill you too. That was very clear. But what has happened now that I find so interesting is that there's a generation of us that did what we were told and who now are of an age where we find the idea of dying, knowing that we didn't really do what we came here to do, actually scarier than the thought that they might kill us if we do. And there is like a third on the piano. I'm finding this fascinating. I always say I like older people and I like younger people. It's those people in between that are so hard to take, because the younger people coming up have this visceral, it's your lives depend on it. And I appreciate that. And there's an what do they call it today? An intergenerational resonance, which is very good, because some of us we have to do this work. We have to make this effort. We have to wage this revolutionary spirit so that we can die, and others of us, we have to do it so that we can live. There is so much gold in all of that. There is so much gold. And so, yes, I think the older you are, the more you know certain things. The younger you are, the more you know certain other things. Every generation has its own gifts. Every generation has its own wisdom. And this is not a time to be putting down the young. It's not time to be putting down the old. It's time to be appreciating each other, working together. And I can tell you, I lived at a time where we felt the same frustration people feel today. I admit we didn't feel the system was as rigged as people feel it is today. We also saw the Democratic Party as more of an ally than the left feels it is today. But I believe in miracles, and this country has seen them. There was no reason to believe that the abolitionists could actually achieve abolition. There was no reason to believe that women could actually achieve the right to vote. There was no reason to believe that desegregation of the American South would be possible. But there were those who did believe, who did create that space of conviction and faith and possibility. And I think that we're going to do the same thing in this generation. And I have that faith. And I have faith not only in a higher power, I have faith in us. And that's where Joe Biden, and I do agree, don't count us out. You don't know who we are if they're going to count us out.
So Marianne, before we let you go, in addition to, of course, being a champion for Nina Turner, as you have been, and Stephen Donziger, who you've been speaking about publicly lately, are there any, other causes or forthcoming books or projects that you're working on that you want to quickly shout out?
Yeah, Daniel Hale. Because, at first we have to talk about Assange and we have to talk about Donziger and also now Daniel Hale. This idea of the way the system is attacking whistleblowers should be of great concern to all of us. Great concern to all of us. And I believe that for the sake of free speech, for the sake of standing up against military secrecy, which is a pillar of imperialist militaristic activity. So yes, I hope that we will all, I know it's tiring, I know it's exhausting. Every time you feel you've got one, you've got to do another, but we do. So I hope that more and more people will become aware of the Daniel Hale case, in addition to Assange and in addition to Donziger. And thank you for asking. My book, Politics of Love, will be coming out in paperback, I think in August. And I will be doing more things next month. And if people go into my social media, I'm not quiet about any of it when it happens.
As I said before, Marianne does have a YouTube channel, so check that out.
Yeah. And I have great conversations. I just had a conversation recently with Daniel Ellsberg. I've had some really, really good conversations recently, and a new podcast that is coming out. I recently, some of those interviews, I'm afraid to say any of the other names because, okay, what about the people that I didn't say? But anybody can go to my social media and see the things we've been doing, plus candidatesummit.com, because I have endorsed some great progressive congressional primary candidates. And if I may say something about that, I find that the progressive movement, one of the places where I think some growth could be achieved here, or some movement, I don't know if you call it growth. You know, the right creates stars. The left only wants to embrace people who are already stars. But there are so many great progressives who are, because they're not corporate backed, because they don't have their own personal wealth, because the Chuck Schumers of the world, the Adam Schiffs of the world are doing everything possible to make them not the candidate. I mean, look at this proxy war that's happening in Ohio 11. But this is being acted out in every district. There are a lot of people who they're not as powerful as Nina Turner yet, but you get them out there, they will be as powerful as Nina Turner. So I hope people will go to candidatesummit.com and other places where you can see that there are wonderful people running in these primaries and they need the support now. Create the next political leaders. Don't just bemoan the fact that the leaders we have aren't doing what you want them to do. Don't just think in terms of pressuring them. Think in terms of replacing them. And we do enough of that and get enough of that started, I think some really great things can happen in the next few years.
Well said.
All right. Thank you so much, Marianne, for joining us.
Thank you. It was wonderful being with you.
Thank you, Marianne.
All right.
That was a great note to end on. I think that the point about Republicans making stars, I think, is so true. And it's also the case that Republicans have put so much of their time and energy into, state and local races, whereas I think for a long time, Democrats kind of looked at the larger congressional races or, of course, the presidential races. And those are important, too. But I think Mike Davis has a really good analysis of how, you wake up after a couple decades and the Republicans control every state legislature. So, right.
Yeah, I think
so I definitely co-sign her need to, from the left kind of create a new generation or like create a new cohort of progressive politicians.
Right. And it kind of goes back to the Barry Goldwater thing where he lost that election badly, but the right wing really went to work at the local level and really built up an infrastructure that we're seeing the results of now.
Right. It was invisible until it wasn't.
Right.
All right. Well, on that note, it's been a kind of longer show for us. We had two different guests, but I really enjoyed speaking with both Matt and Marianne, obviously. Matt, as I said, we're hoping to get back at some point as our kind of unofficial welfare state correspondent. And just again, next week, we will be back with Adolph Reed and Walter Ben Michaels, our faves. So don't miss that.
Hey, it's me, it's the producer.
And Young Kale has a message.
I've arrived. No, I want to thank Matt and Marianne as well. As the producer, I'm going to say it was a good episode. Sorry, guys. But sad to end on a little bit of a more dour note. unfortunately, we missed this the other week because we were off. And then we also got additional sad news today that 2 important left journalists have recently passed away. The first being Dawn Foster. Dawn has been a writer for Jacobin for most of our history, really. You can go back in our backlog and read some of our articles. I really recommend people check out her coverage of the Grenfell Tower fire and collapse back in 2017. Her article's titled "Very Political Tragedy." Dawn was someone who she was a working class person, and that reflected in her political coverage. And it's something that's sorely lacking in general in media, obviously, especially British media. And so not only did we lose a working class journalist, but someone who is as brilliant, eloquent, and as compassionate as Dawn was. And she was someone that really, and you can see this in her writing, that, she looks at something like the Grenfell Tower disaster, and, her answer to that isn't like, wow, it's so bad that, these people got trapped in this situation. We should feel bad about this and be angry about it. It was, no, this is a political situation, that this was a political decision to put these people in this tower, that policies and politics have determined their outcome, that there's no reason why they had to have ended up in this disaster. And so she was always able to keep these 2 threads in mind, both the actual coverage of what's going on, and then the political trajectory of like why this is happening, not naturalizing disaster and chaos in the world, but saying, no, actually we deserve a much better world than this. So she is sorely missed, and we extend our condolences. We also got news earlier today of the loss of Glen Ford. Paul, do you want to maybe say something briefly about Glen?
Yeah, Glen Ford was the editor of Black Agenda Report. I was lucky enough to see him speak in person at a conference at Temple University a few years back. And, Black Agenda Report, for those familiar, and if you're not, you should definitely check them out. I mean, they really, when we're in the wilderness for years, advancing a critique that thankfully I think is becoming more common now. And I think something we try to talk a lot about in the show, but, really critiquing narrow identity politics, really taking a critical view on Black politics in the United States. And, some of the first to really call out, a lot of people and politicians that kind of very cynically use identity and how that hurts the majority of Black working people. So I kind of see them as trailblazers in that, and that's become more popular. They were out there critiquing Obama very stridently and very critically at a time when that was very difficult to do. So Glen Ford will definitely be sorely missed, and I definitely miss his analysis. And not too long before, we also had lost Bruce Dixon from Black Agenda Report. So I just want to honor Glen Ford, and he's definitely going to be missed on the left.
Yeah, and just to echo Marianne's final point, that we need a new generation of socialist organizers and activists and thinkers, but that also includes journalists, that working class journalists who actually understand what working class life is like, and actually go and speak with working people instead of just kind of pontificating about them from some New York, the New York Times office. I'm attacking the New York Times right now.
You don't call them to wish them happy birthday, just like Bernie? No.
They don't return my calls. So,
so you are trying.
It's a mutual disrespect.
The best kind.
No, we're obviously we're all really cool with the New York Times. But the point being, we need more like serious working class journalists and analysts of what's going on right now. That can't, they're not going to appear out of nowhere. And and when tragedy strikes, you really feel the loss. So.
So at the end of this episode, you basically have 3 options: become a working class journalist, run for office, or become a shop steward.
That's right.
There you go.
Only 3. Or start a YouTube channel.
Right. All right. Well, this was a great show. Again, please tune in next week for Adolph Reed. frequent interviewee and contributor to Black Agenda Report, by the way, and Walter Ben Michaels. I think that's going to be a really fun interview. And we will see you all next week.
Hit like, hit subscribe, share us, hit the buttons. They're in front of you. You can see the buttons, hit the buttons. Okay.
Hit them.
Bye, guys.
Good night.